Good morning. I'm sure everyone is busy getting ready for the Pesach holiday that is almost upon us, and very happy to be with everyone today. We'll mention that we will not be having class next Wednesday, as it is a partial travel day for me. And then stay tuned for announcements in the WhatsApp chat if we will be having a Wednesday shiur on Chol Hamoed, Pesach or not. Today we are here to discuss the opening of the third volume of the Torah, Parshas VaYikra, and also some Pesach preparation, as this will be our final class before Pesach begins, a week from this Motzai Shabbos. Of course, we start Shabbos before in many ways because it is Shabbos leading immediately into Pesach on Saturday night, Motzai Shabbos. The title for today's class, in addition to Pesach preparation, is Inviting and Everlasting Intimacy. I just want to explain that the word inviting has two very different meanings. One is a verb and one is an adjective. And I mean them in both senses of the word. In terms of the verb, we're talking about how someone invites someone else into an everlasting intimacy relationship. And we're also talking about what makes it appealing or inviting from an adjective perspective to be in that everlasting intimacy relationship with another person. Also, of course, with Hashem. This month of classes is sponsored Le'iloi Nishmat Leah Bat Avraham Lissy Galsky, beloved mother, wife, and friend. Lissy Galsky is a dear friend of our family. She departed too early. We are very close with her family, her children, extended family, her husband. May he be well and healthy, and all of them. The message is that we wish that the light that left a void be missed, because we know that it will be missed by all that knew her. So this class is dedicated to Le'ilui Nishmas, and this month of class is Le'ilui Nishmas Leah Bat Avraham, beloved mother, wife, and friend. Your light left a void that will be missed by all that knew you. From what I understand, she was an incredibly vibrant and exciting and empowering human being, and for sure her family misses her dearly. We wish them all a tremendous nechama, and we value our relationship with all of them, and we thank them for their support, but most importantly, we really wish that they should somehow recover and be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Yerushalayim. This week's class is sponsored in the merit of Refuah Shlema for Yisrael ben Rachel, Meir ben Ruth, Chaim Yitzchak ben Chaya Baracha, and Yidel ben Rachel. And of course, among all the other Cholei Yisrael. There is no doubt that Pesach commemorates, you know what, before I go into this, let me mention again that people, unfortunately, have figured out how to scam by using WhatsApp chats and by trolling contact information somehow. I don't know exactly how. And please be assured that if you're getting a message from anyone that I asked them to call you and ask you for money, that is a lie. That you will not get that message from anyone. And if you do, it will be somebody who is a member from the yeshiva. And so if you have any questions at all, please let me know, private message me. You can let anybody in the yeshiva know, and hopefully we can avoid anyone being taken for a ride. There is no doubt that Pesach commemorates the beginning of Hashem's remarkable relationship with the Jewish nation. It is also undisputed that the significance and intensity of this relationship between the Jewish people and Hashem is a major theme of our entire Torah, and is clearly attested by the events of both Jewish and, on a more broad scale, world history. Now, of course, we can sit and talk about all the different ways that the Torah discusses this, such as Shir Hashirim being the Holy of Holies. It is a song, a love song, reflecting the unique relationship that is incredibly romantic and picturesque and gorgeous. Shir Hashirim does that. We know of all the prophecies. We know of all the different ways that we've disappointed Hashem, all the repercussions, all the miracles that Hashem has done for us, all the love that Hashem has shown for us. So that's clear. In terms of world history, all one needs to do is recognize the way that media news regarding Israel and the Jewish people for most of the 20th century has been extremely prominent. That's just obvious. Just look at the world news every single day. Furthermore, here locally, so to speak, in our class and for Jews across the world, we are now beginning the third volume of the Chumash, the subject of our intimate relationship with Hashem via the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and its services. It thus behooves us to understand the fundamental principles of intimacy, its significance, and how to build it. Indeed, for most people, the level of closeness in a relationship is determined by how intimate it is. A relatively recent article in Psychology Today, by that I mean less than a year ago, in August of 2024, this article explains the need for human beings to have emotional intimacy. Of course, physical intimacy is another component, right? So intimacy overall, but just on the subject of emotional intimacy, the article says, emotional intimacy, the foundation of a deep, fulfilling connection between partners. This essential component of a strong relationship not only enhances the bonds between couples and people, but also significantly contributes to their overall well-being. Strengthening emotional closeness can lead to increased happiness, trust, and resilience within the relationship, making it a crucial aspect of long-term relational satisfaction. So what is emotional intimacy? Emotional intimacy is the bond that forms through deep feelings of connection, understanding, and vulnerability between partners. It involves the ability to open up, give and receive affection, and share a mutual understanding of each other's needs, desires, and emotions. Recent research underscores the importance of emotional intimacy in relationships, revealing that couples with high levels of emotional closeness experience greater partner satisfaction, improved communication, and reduced conflict. Conversely, relationships lacking in emotional intimacy are more likely to face issues such as increased partner conflict and feelings of loneliness or disconnection. So let's now look at the first paragraph of Sefer VaYikra with the first Rashi, because we are going to learn here a tremendous amount about building emotional intimacy. So the Torah's opening word of this third volume is VaYikra, and he called. And the first sentence says, and he called to Moshe, and Hashem spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying the following, to speak to the Jewish people and say to them that a man, when he will bring close an offering to Hashem from the kosher animals of cattle and sheep, etc., if he will bring an olah offering, which is generally loosely translated as a burnt offering, if he brings a burnt offering, a male that is unblemished he shall bring, and he takes it to the entranceway of the tent of meeting, which is right where the tabernacle meets the courtyard surrounding the tabernacle. He brings it there for his will, meaning intentionally, and for his atonement in front of Hashem. He puts his hand on the head of the offering, and it will appease for him in order to atone for him. He slaughters the offering, and the Kohanim bring close the offering, including throwing its blood, skinning the offering, cutting it into pieces, putting onto the altar, onto the fire and the wood of the altar, arranging the pieces so that they are burnt and all the innards get washed, and the Kohen offers everything up to the altar as an offering to Hashem. So, one of the very interesting features of this paragraph is that we seem to be talking about a very interesting relationship between Hashem and man, in that somehow offering an animal is supposed to achieve something in the relationship that is positive. Now, that's difficult enough to understand. We are not doing a deep dive on that today. But what's even more interesting for the purposes of our conversation is that the term that the Torah uses to describe Hashem is not Elohim, but rather Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Adonai, which is the most essential name that we have to describe Hashem, even though it seems to be like physical action of a very coarse nature, in a sense, that's bringing an upgrade to this relationship with Hashem that is the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. So that itself is just worth noting. Now let's understand the first sentence, and he called to Moshe, and Hashem spoke to him, Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? The essence, Yud Kei Vav Kei, whatever that means, of Hashem spoke to Moshe from the tent of meeting, saying, Rashi asks the question that seemingly, what's the purpose of calling and then speaking to him if you could just speak to him? Why do we have calling before speaking? It should just say, like many times the Torah does say, and Hashem spoke to Moshe saying. Instead, over here it says, and he called to Moshe. So says Rashi, that we learn from this sentence that every single time that Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, he first called to him. That means he first said, Moshe, or whatever would be a form of a calling to Moshe, before starting to speak to Moshe. He did that every single time in the Torah, whether it was a commandment or a message to the Jewish people of some kind. Every single time, Hashem said first, Moshe. He called to him first, and then he spoke to him. And Rashi continues, which is a language of chiba. Chiba means love. So calling to Moshe is a language of love. And in fact, it is the language that the divine angels, the Malachei Hasharis, the angels that serve God, it is the language that angels use, as we know, and in fact, we say very often, daily, even several times a day in our prayer, that we say that the angels call to one another, and then they sanctify God by saying, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. This is a calling, which is a language of love that the angels use when they sanctify God. And this is all in contrast with the prophets of the world, meaning other prophets, not even prophets of the Jewish people, that when the divine presence appears to them, it doesn't say that Hashem calls to these secular, so to speak, prophets, but rather that Hashem appears in a fashion that is temporary, as opposed to the word VaYikra, which means and he calls. The language that is used for the non-Jewish prophets is the language of VaYikar, which means that Hashem appears, and it implies a sort of temporary communication, and also impurity. And in fact, that is the way the Torah describes Hashem appearing to Bil'am, the most famous of the non-Jewish prophets, and therefore, says Rashi, that God called to Moshe as opposed to appearing like Hashem does to the non-Jewish prophets of the world, which is in a language that is temporary and impure. Okay, so there's a lot that we need to understand about this Rashi. We're going to ask a few questions on basically the opening here of Sefer VaYikra, including on this Rashi. And then we're going to go into Pesach overview questions, and then we are going to begin our answer. So question number one is that it's extremely interesting to note that the name of this third volume is VaYikra, the word that we're discussing, and he called. And seemingly that is a rather generic, innocuous term to use for a sefer, for a volume that discusses the intimate relationship that we have with Hashem. Just as easily, seemingly, the Torah could have started off something with related to karban, offering, which is the next sentence uses the word when a man brings a karban to Hashem, and we could have a sefer, a volume of the Torah called karban or karbanot, right? Offerings, or perhaps service, avodah. So why is the title of the Sefer VaYikra, VaYikra, as opposed to offerings or service? Why are we focusing on he called rather than on the offerings or the service? That's question number one. Question number two. According to Rashi, this language of calling means a language of love, as opposed to a temporary and impure concept. And the question is, why is I should first point out, why is calling a language of love at all? What's the simple explanation? What about calling makes it a love language? As far as I'm familiar, the 5 languages book doesn't ever say because you call to the other person. A love language is calling to them. And for anybody who's ever called or been called by a spouse across the house, we don't always think of that as a love language. So why is calling a love language? But also, why is the opposite of this love of chiba that is somehow reflected by calling, why is the opposite of that paradigm of communication temporary and impure communication? I would have thought the opposite of affection or love language would be disaffection or hatred or ignoring, right? Not temporary and impure. So why is the opposite of chiba love and that paradigm of communication? Why is the opposite of that temporary and impure communication? And then question number 3 is, what does it mean that the angels call to each other in a loving way? First of all, what does that mean? What are we supposed to understand about relationships and of angels that they call to each other in a loving way? And why specifically when they're sanctifying God, kadosh, 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 are they calling to other angels? That actually seems to not make any sense at all. Every angel should simply say kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. If they all have to start at the same time, then somebody can call go, and they all start at the same time. Right? What does it mean that they call to each other? And this is obviously so important because we're always repeating this whenever we say kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. We're always saying, by the way, the angels call to each other and they say kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. So somehow this is a fundamental principle. It's emphasized over and over again daily in our davening. What is up with this languaging of calling the angels to one another? Okay, so those are our Sefer VaYikra questions. Let me mention 3 questions relating to Pesach. These are also basically overview questions, and then we're going to come back to answering, with an outline, so to speak, philosophical outline. We'll answer our VaYikra questions, and then we'll answer the Pesach questions. Question number 1, and it is a question that we have asked before. We'll ask it again. Why is the name of this holiday, which is by almost all accounts the most celebrated holiday of Jewish history, why is it called Pesach, which means Passover, skip over? Hashem hopped over the houses of the Jewish firstborn en route to killing the Egyptian firstborn. Why is that the name for the holiday as opposed to a detail of one of the miracles of the holiday? Why don't we instead call this holiday redemption? That's what it is. God redeemed us. We constantly talk about Hashem taking us out of Egypt. So this is before the redemption. Why not focus on the main point, which would seem to be the fact that Hashem took us out from Egypt, not simply that he passed over our firstborn when killing the Egyptian firstborn? That's question number 1. Question number 2, why is there a mitzvah commandment to eat matzah only on the first night of Pesach and not all 7 days? What's very interesting about this question also is that the Torah seems to say in several places that there's a mitzvah to eat matzah all 7 days. Nonetheless, the very clear halachic ruling that we have is that we are only obligated to eat the matzah on the first night of Pesach. There is a discussion among some commentaries that a person could get credit for eating on the other days of Pesach if they eat matzah, but there's certainly no obligation according to anyone. Why is that? If eating matzah is somehow an important thing, and we're observing the holiday of Pesach and Chag HaMatzos, it's also called that for 7 days, why should we only have the mitzvah on the first night? Why is that the only obligation? That's question number 2. And question number 3 is, why are the customs of inviting guests at the beginning of the meal? So first of all, many people have the custom to invite guests before the meal, but all of us have the custom of inviting guests at the meal when we say the halach ma'anya, right? Kol dichrin yeseh v'yechol, anyone who's hungry should come and eat. Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach, anyone who needs should come and celebrate Pesach. That's an invitation. Why is it so important to do that, especially at the beginning of the meal? My father has brilliant and beautiful answers to this. We might mention a little bit of that here today, but please try to call the yeshiva office for Haggadah cards if you don't have them already. And we'll discuss that a little bit more. But why is that custom of inviting guests at the beginning of the Pesach Seder that we recite in the Haggadah, as well as the custom of asking questions? We have the 4 questions, and of course we know that there's questions that are asked throughout the night at any typical Jewish Seder. Why are those ingredients of the Pesach Seder so important? So those are our 3 overview questions. So we're going to come back first to answer the VaYikra questions, and I will be repeating the questions again in our answer, so don't worry about a summary on that for right now. So I'd like to begin. We really need to do a deep dive philosophically for about 2 minutes, understanding Hashem's creation and sort of the goal of this creation as taught to us by the Torah, some of the difficulties in understanding it, but what we're left with based on what we do understand, combined with the elements that we don't understand. And this will be a basis for understanding intimacy relationships. One of the fundamental philosophical enigmas of creation, meaning we understand Hashem created the world, and there's an inherent enigma in that. And what is that? How is it that the God that is everything creates something that is not Him, often referred to as other? Now, other is a difficult term, but that is the term that's easiest to use. And we're going to come back and maybe use another term. And in fact, if anybody at the end of the class would like to give me a different term rather than other, or another term, if we're going to get really confusing, that will be great. But the bottom line is that we don't understand how God, who was the thing that always existed, and the only thing, that's part of what Hashem Echad means, the only thing that always existed, somehow creates something other than God. It's a very, very difficult paradox. A lot of Hasidus and Kabbalah revolves around trying to give words to somehow resolving this paradox. But the bottom line is, nobody has a full understanding of that, because the answer to this question has to be beyond human comprehension, because on some level, understanding it would be like understanding the essence of God, and then a person would need to be God in order to understand the essence of God. So we'll accept that we don't have a full understanding of how God that is everything creates other, meaning something outside of God. Nonetheless, there's a major outgrowth from understanding that this is indeed what happened. God that is everything created something other than God. And the major outgrowth is in two parts. Outgrowth number one, aside from the fact that God somehow did this, because hopefully all of us know, all of us in this class, and hopefully healthy human beings know that as much as they might have an ego, they are not God. It reminds me of the famous joke of what's the difference between God and a doctor. And the answer is, God does not think he's a doctor, right? The idea, hopefully, is that healthy human beings understand, no matter how much they know, they are not God. Okay, so now the two outgrowths of understanding all of this is that, number one, nothing is really completely separate than God. So as much as we say God creates an other, there is still a partnership with God and everything else that is created. Another way to say this is that there is a collective oneness, and that also was part of what we mean of echad, God is one. Some fashion, even though we don't have accurate ways to understand in terms to describe, everything is still part of the oneness of God. So everything that exists in some capacity or fashion is in partnership with God. Another good way to think of this is that when it comes to human beings, we know human beings are directly created in the image of God. And since everything is in the image of God, or a reflection of God, that means on some level, everything is connected because they're connected to God, and they are each independently, so to speak, a reflection of God, which by definition means they're not independent and that there is a partnership. So therefore, another possible term to use, rather than creating an other, it's creating the possibility of a partner. That would be another possibility to describe something, so to speak, outside of God. God created a partner, which the Jewish people are certainly seen as a partner to God on many, many levels. I don't want to get too bogged down into that. The point is that that's one outgrowth, that when creation happens, as much as things are separate, they're still connected. So as much as there's an other, there's also a partner, so to speak, with God. The second major outgrowth, especially the way the Torah explains it, is that God desires a relationship with this other, with this partner. So therefore, the work of creation is as much as possible in an ongoing way to build even greater closeness between God and his creation, God and the other, God and the partner. That process is what is the concept of intimacy. And so therefore, the Torah is the guidebook of how to achieve this goal. The ever-growing and building of this closeness is called intimacy. And therefore, our definition of ultimate intimacy is the process of building closeness and always striving for a greater level of oneness, which continues infinitely, because there will never be a complete oneness, because there will always be a partnership, because there will always be an other, but you're getting closer and closer and closer and closer infinitely And that is just an amazing thing, that this is what God did when he created man. So how is this achieved? How does it happen that God that is everything creates an other and a partner, and now we have a guidebook of how to achieve this ultimate intimacy and ever-growing closeness? What needs to happen in order for that to happen in terms of God and his creation, or the Jewish people, pending, hopefully everybody can somehow join together with this concept with the Jewish people, which is part of what we understand as Jews to be our mission in the world, is to bring everybody into this relationship with God as much as possible. And even though we don't proselytize, we invite people in, and that's really what we're getting to now. Number one, how is this achieved? By recognizing that we are capable of being more than who we are by conjoining with others. Now, this is a great time for me to mention this. I was just meeting yesterday with Eric Meadow, who is on this class, and we were talking about the Gestalt principle, which is that the sum of its parts is greater than any one of the parts. And that's true about the oneness of Hashem and the oneness that human beings can have with each other. It's why there is a concept called synergy. There is a concept called 1 + 1 = 3, right? Because the two together is better than the two alone. That's part of the essence of the creation story. And so by recognizing that all beings are really in a partnership potential that will allow for a much greater integration with one another, and therefore not only does one person become greater, but together everybody becomes greater than they could ever be divided. That's an amazing platform to understand why relationships are important, and building relationships and building intimacy is so important. Okay, so we have to have that recognition. Number two, we have to have a deep awareness of the other, or what we're now calling the partner, the potential partner. Number three, we must validate the other. In other words, the other partner, that the potential relationship that exists, we have to acknowledge their importance, both for their sake and for our sake, because we can't really be connected to something that we don't recognize. It doesn't work, right? So we have to validate the other, give them a feeling of significance, because we need that and they need that. Also, number four, conveying the desire to build a long-term relationship with the other. And that's key for our understanding here in VaYikra. There has to be a message that says, I desire to be in a long-term relationship with you. There are so many ways that that's conveyed in Judaism. I'll give you two simple ways. Number one is the word shalom. The word shalom, which means hello and goodbye, is about completion. So whether it's hello we're involved, or it's goodbye and we're not going to see each other right now, we're still part of the same oneness. Shalom. That is the word shalom, literally. On top of that, there's a law that when you invite a guest into your home, not only do you give them food and drink, but you accompany them when they leave, because you're showing a relationship is forming. You have to have that as part of the relationship, or else it feels very negative, the relationship. My father has spoken about this for years. Many of you are familiar with that. I don't want to get sidetracked with that now, but please, anybody who wants, think about that or do a deep dive with me on that. Be very happy to continue that. Also, critically important, and what's being taught here in Sefer VaYikra is not only that you have to convey that you recognize the value in a long-term relationship with the other, there must be a pathway created for reconciliation as part of the foundation of the relationship. If there isn't an ability to say, I messed up, I'm sorry, and forgiveness to happen, it's not going to work in a human relationship to have a long-term relationship, because we're just not perfect. And that's what's happening here in Sefer VaYikra. In this Sefer, in this volume, where the Torah is describing the ultimate intimacy and how close we can get into the Holy of Holies, and all of that is the concept of atonement through offerings. That's part of the foundation of an intimacy relationship. So there has to be a pathway created for reconciliation as the permanent structure feature of the relationship. Number six, there has to be a willingness and a desire to leave the comfort zone of aloneness or isolation and instead cross the bridge to the other. If we can't do that, we can't actually really experience the other. And we see that clearly also in Sefer VaYikra by Hashem stationing himself so to speak, in our world. How does that even make sense? God is everything, somehow puts himself into this space because we are also a partner, even though we don't understand how, and God positions himself with us. God is totally left, so to speak, his comfort zone in order to do that. Number 7, we need to invite the other as opposed to impose on the other. Now, if anybody has a right to impose, it is the God that is everything. But does he impose? No. He calls first. He knocks on the door first. He says, hello, I recognize you. I validate you and your existence. I want to have a relationship with you. I'm not forcing myself upon you, which answers another major question. Why is it here that we learn that God calls? God called to Moshe the first time he spoke to him at the Sneh. The Torah says God called to Moshe and he spoke to him. Over there it uses the word Elohim, which is also very instructive, but it says God called him and then he spoke to him. So why don't we learn it from there that God always called before he spoke? You know why? Sure, God always called before he spoke, but once he became present in the tabernacle, maybe he just said, okay, I'm here, let's go. Supper, time to relate to me. No, even when God makes himself present in our domain, knocks on the door first. And we learn that from VaYikra because that is the most powerful recognition of the other-centeredness of God, that even when he's here, and he, so to speak, left his comfort zone. And as we're going to see in a moment, he's making himself vulnerable to our wrongdoings. He knocks on the door first. It's literally incredible. And that leads us to number 8 and 9, right? So we just mentioned that number 7, by inviting the other or the potential partner as opposed to imposing. Number 8, by being vulnerable to the ups and downs of relationships and a willingness to take not now as an answer. I would suggest that in the secular world, when they're doing the marital vows, part of in sickness and whatever, it should also be in sickness and in health. And when the other person says not now, that should be part of the vow, right? That's part of the essential ups and downs in a relationship. Okay, but that's what we do when we're committed to building intimacy. Number 9, finally, for our list today, is by believing in who the other is becoming as opposed to who they are. Part of an intimacy build in a relationship is that we value who the potential partner is able to become and the way that they're starting to become it, and we invest in that even though they're not there yet. So now we come back to answer a question. We'll start with our Pesach questions and then come back to the VaYikra questions. Why is the name of the holiday Pesach, Passover, and not redemption? Exactly for what we just said. Because when Hashem passed over the Jewish firstborn en route to slaying the Egyptian firstborn, what Hashem was saying is, listen, you Jewish people, really, it is true that on a very basic level, you don't deserve to survive this night either. You have not fully rejected idolatry. You have not fully bought into the program of a relationship with Hashem, but you started because you slaughtered the Egyptian god, which is the Paschal lamb, what that represents. You've done the circumcision as the rabbis teach us. So now you're beginning. Okay, after a long time, you're finally making real steps to get on the path towards God, but you're still very far from it. You're still having a very hard time leaving it behind. As we know, many of the Jews who were there actually could not leave it behind. Okay, you started. You're not there yet. I accept to look at who you're becoming as part of my commitment to this love relationship. That's why it's called Pesach, because overlooking, passing over, skipping over the flaws of our partners is part of the commitment to an intimacy build. Okay, so why is there a mitzvah to eat matzah only on the first night and not all 7 days? Why is that the requirement? My answer is because if there would be a mitzvah to eat matzah on all 7 days, you would say the mitzvah is about eating matzah. But the truth is that the mitzvah is not as much about eating matzah as it is incorporating what happened that first night as the foundation of our relationship. What happened that first night? We did circumcision, we slaughtered the firstborn, and slaughtered the Paschal lamb to commemorate the miracle of the firstborn. And that year it was to become worthy of that miracle. And we did that as a sign of us committing to an intimacy build with Hashem. Now, part of what matzah really represents is that we're able to recognize that we have to change the way we think. And most people wouldn't think, oh, let's stop it from becoming delicious bread and let's have matzah instead. Most people would say, what are you talking about? If you just leave it alone and you don't interrupt the status quo, it'll be better. Right. But the Torah and Hashem are here to say, hey, what everybody thinks is the status quo is not necessarily good. You have to interrupt that process. You have to be willing to think differently about everything in the world. You have to be willing to recognize the Hashem instead of the idols and all the false ideologies of the world. That's what matzah represents, but it represents it that night. That's the obligation of that night, is to flip your mind around, see a different paradigm, see a different world. So therefore, the mitzvah is to incorporate that way of thinking into our lives, which is why we tell the wise son who asks about all the commandments of the Torah, we tell him one thing. The main thing is matzah and the paschal lamb, the first night of Pesach. That should never leave your mind, ever. Because the foundation is that we recognize that we are on an intimacy build with Hashem, that Hashem is on an intimacy build with us, and we ratify that by the mitzvah of matzah that happens on the first night, that Hashem took us out, that we were eager to go out, that we went out quickly, that we, God wanted us to go out, and the Egyptians were also making us hurry. All of that is to commemorate the relationship, intimacy, building that is starting on the first night of Pesach. So for those commentaries who say that there is a fulfillment of the rest of Pesach to eat matzah, it's only a fulfillment in the sense that it bolsters, it ratifies, it concretizes the mitzvah of matzah that's starting the first night, which is everything about establishing this intimacy build with Hashem and the Jewish people. And finally, why are the customs of inviting guests at the beginning of the meal and asking questions such an integral part of the Seder? It's very simple. If you're not inviting into a relationship, that means you're either avoiding or you're imposing. The only paradigm that works to build intimacy is an invitation. What an invitation means, I acknowledge the significance of the other as a potential partner, and I'm inviting them, and I'm asking if I can be invited. And it's a very vulnerable thing to do, right? How many times have we asked people, right? We've invited people to something and they said no. Doesn't feel great, because we know on some level that that's a rejection, right? That's why most of the time people say, oh, I wish I could, but I can't. Well, if you don't say you wish you could, you're basically saying you're not interested, and that's a rejection. So even extending an invitation is vulnerable. And it also allows the other person to know that you recognize their significance and their right to say yes or no. That's validating that. So therefore, if any person wants to build an intimacy relationship with another, it has to start with a very gentle invitation. And I say this so clearly because unfortunately, much of today's generation does not know how to build intimacy relationships. And I've experienced this as an educator. I've experienced it as a family person. People simply don't know. And this is the simple answer. The answer is by extending a gentle invitation that is underpinned with real respect, a real opportunity for the other one to say no or yes, and that you are expressing that you have a desire, this is very important, for something significant and hopefully longer term. Everything else is temporary and everything else is not holy. But before we get to that, because that takes us back to Sefer VaYikra, the bottom line is that when you help someone feel comfortable, that's when the questions begin. Because until there's comfort and a feeling of validation, people don't feel themselves vulnerable enough to ask questions. Because when I ask the question, A, I'm admitting I don't know, B, I'm opening myself up to your ideas, right? That's an incredibly vulnerable thing to do, which is why in today's politics, there is no such thing as engaging the other person in question, because you don't want that relationship. That's what's happening in the world. We're not interested in your viewpoint. The only thing that exists is my viewpoint, and either you see it my way or there's the highway, right? That's what recently on our classes I've been referring to as an authoritarian democracy. Supposedly, other people have a right to speak, but really I don't give them any entitlement or significance or listening to their speaking. And even more than that, usually when I can eliminate their speaking, that's when I'm happiest. That's what's happening in our society. So the whole Pesach Seder is to give everyone a feeling, hey, this is an invitation to join. This is an invitation to become partners. This is an invitation to a relationship build, and that should spawn endless questions. And that's why questions are such an integral part of the Pesach Seder as well. And so now we go back to our VaYikra questions, then we'll conclude with questions and comments. Why is the title of the Sefer VaYikra as opposed to offerings or service? Because it's an invitation. God is literally saying, I'm here, I'm inviting you in, I acknowledge your significance, I've made myself vulnerable to you. It's all about, I would love to have a relationship with you. I'm going to be setting up a permanent forgiveness structure, which is unbelievable. Every Yom Kippur, we start again. That's part and parcel of the relationship. Incredible. That's just a permanent feature in the structure of our relationship with Hashem. That's why it's called VaYikra. Number two, why is the opposite of this? Oh, first, why is VaYikra love? Because that's what it is. Love means I want a long-term intimate relationship with you. That's what it means. So therefore, a calling and an invitation is exactly that. Why is the opposite of that paradigm of communication temporary and impure communication? That's what we call just doing business. It's just business. It's not personal. Yeah, I understand, but I don't have room for you, so therefore you're fired. It's just business. It's not personal, right? It's temporary. It's transactional. There is no concept of the everlasting future. And that's impure because anything that's not everlasting is not connected to Hashem. Anything that is everlasting is connected to Hashem. You can take that to the bank. All evil will disintegrate. All good is everlasting. All truth is infinite. All falsehood will evaporate. That's the difference between being connected to Hashem or not. So all the prophecies of Hashem to the Jewish people, that's part of the infinite future. All the prophecies of Hashem to the non-Jewish prophets of the world that didn't eventually serve to become connected to Hashem is also temporary. And so, in fact, it's interesting, Bilam's prophecies were actually permanent, but Bilam is eliminated. That's what the rabbis tell us. Bilam has no share in the world to come. So to the extent that Bilam's prophecies became permanent, that's Torah and that's holy. But Bilam himself, connecting to Bilam himself, that was temporary because Bilam himself canceled himself out of infinite existence. And finally, what does it mean that angels call to each other in a loving way when they are reciting Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh? The answer is angels too have to understand that they cannot have a relationship with Hashem if they cannot have a relationship with other angels. It's all connected. And one angel's attribute of mercy versus another angel's attribute of strict justice versus another angel's attribute of compassion. All of this is connected because it's all a reflection of Hashem. And more than that, if any angel thinks that their perception of Hashem is absolute, then they're disconnected from the oneness. So the only way to sanctify the truth of God's oneness is by being able to see much more than our limited viewpoint. And the only way we can see much more than each individual's limited viewpoint is to represent that you validate every other servant of God as them having a legitimate viewpoint. And so therefore each angel calls to each angel to acknowledge the importance of each angel, to invite each angel together as a part of the oneness to sanctify the name of Hashem, and to also really learn from each angel what the other angel perceives about God, which is why we also say that each angel gives the other one permission. That's the language we use in our prayers to sanctify the name of God. So I think I've explained a lot about the practical implications, but just to finish in a sort of a summary view, Sefer VaYikra and the holiday of Pesach are all about building an intimacy relationship with Hashem. It's unbelievable to think about what Hashem did in order to demonstrate to us his interest and his commitment and his willingness. Really incredible. Of course, we have to learn from that. We also should feel unbelievably validated by that. And we have to do the same for all of our fellow human beings, especially our fellow Jews. That's the first level of family that we have. And then hopefully we can invite everyone in to the brotherhood of mankind by being gentle and inviting and showing interest and validation and recognizing the importance that each other has as a partner in our creation. Questions or comments? So I'll just go to one question that's on the chat, and it's a very good question, and it's very important to address. The question that was asked, let me just read it.
I don't need it.
Let me just read it for you. The question that it was asked is, just curious, if the other is a Nazi or represents such a philosophy, does one reach out to develop a relationship? The answer is no. Nazis, Amalek, they represent that there is no God. And in a world that there is no God, there can be no partners, there can be no synergy, there can be no oneness and brotherhood of mankind. When a person has a philosophy that cancels God out of the equation, there is no long-lasting value. Not only do you not reach out to have a relationship with them, we are mandated to destroy them when the time is right. As the Torah tells us about Amalek, first we have to do the work on ourselves, and then eventually we destroy that, ideology. And of course, we say that in the Aleinu every day as well. To destroy all forms of false ideologies from the world. And ultimately, that is that comes to fix the world and establish the world as a kingdom of Hashem. That's the only way we can get there, unfortunately. Of course, we always pray that people who have these wrong philosophies will change. We offer opportunities for them to change, but we cannot somehow succumb to the notion that they have any legitimacy at all. Any other questions or comments? I don't know. I don't know if anybody else is okay. So I think we're good for today, right? Anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody off. Okay, wish everybody a beautiful Pesach. Looking forward to continuing either on Chol HaMoed or shortly after that. Please stay tuned for that announcement. Please zoom over to my father today